Hello, I'm Diana Reich, the Artistic Director of the Charleston to Charleston Literary Festival, Join the Conversation, and I'd like to welcome you from wherever you may be watching. Transforming the way that the festival is delivered, from live appearances to an online version, and offering an even stronger, more diverse and plentiful series of events, is a reflection of our belief that literature and the arts provide a catalyst for dialogue, creativity, empathy, laughter and tears, binding communities together. We're enormously grateful to all our speakers who've dedicated their time and talents to the festival. Please buy their books as a way of enhancing the festival experience. It's my pleasure to invite you, on behalf of my colleagues and board, as well as myself, to join the conversation. We hope that you'll do so in person next November, if at all possible. Charleston in South Carolina is a beautiful, historic and hospitable town, and the Charleston to Charleston Literary Festival will definitely be going from strength to strength.
I'm Suzanne Pollack, Director of Development for the Charleston to Charleston Literary Festival. This year, more than ever, we are so grateful to our generous donors, returning and new, who've made it possible to offer free sessions to everyone everywhere, building a truly international audience. There's still time for you to become a donor. We're taking donations throughout the month of November. So if you would like to become a sponsor, and we urge you to do so, please contact me using my email on the website. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Dr. James Tolley, President of the Waring Library Society Board. We are happy to be collaborating with the Charleston to Charleston Literary Festival this year as part of our expanded lecture series that includes 4 lectures, with 2 more to follow, one in February and one in March. The Library Society supports the work of the Waring Historical Library, located on the campus of the Medical University of South Carolina. The building was originally part of the Porter Military Academy. The library focuses on preserving the history of health sciences in South Carolina, the South, and the Atlantic medical world of the 18th and 19th centuries. Please check us out on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Today's event, the Pandemic Century, will focus on conversations between Mark Honigsbaum and Carl Zimmer. Given the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on all our lives over the last year, it is very fitting that a session which assesses the scientific, medical, and social implications of the pandemics will be released on the opening day of the Charleston to Charleston Literary Festival. Mark Honigsbaum is a medical historian, journalist, and author of 5 books, including The Pandemic Century, 100 Years of Panic, Hysteria, and Hubris, of which he will be discussing today in relation to our current pandemic. His TED animation, How Pandemic Spread, has been viewed millions of times. Carl Zimmer is the author of Planets of Viruses and She Has Her Mother's Laugh. He is adjunct professor of molecular biophysics and biochemistry at Yale University, where he teaches science writing. I would like to thank the Charleston to Charleston Literary Festival for this opportunity to connect with the Waring Historical Library and the Waring Library Society. We hope you enjoy and learn from this presentation. Now and always, please stay safe.
Hi, my name is Carl Zimmer. I'm a columnist for the New York Times, and I'm delighted to be talking with Mark Honigsbaum, the author of The Pandemic Century, here at the Charleston to Charleston Literary Festival. We're talking on Zoom because of a pandemic instead of being able to talk in Charleston in person, which is too bad. But I can't think of a better person to have a conversation with right now than somebody who shares my obsession with viruses and pandemics.
Oh.
So Mark,
Yeah, I would just say likewise, Carl. It's great to have this conversation. It's like, you know, what we do for a living, so it should just be like having a conversation with ourselves here.
yeah. I mean, I don't know what it's like for you. I mean, you know, I would imagine that like up until now, like maybe friends kind of thought you were like, you know, the one who has kind of had a weird obsession with pandemics and diseases, and now all of a sudden everybody wants to ask you the questions, right? I get that.
Yeah, it was that's kind of like, I mean, so this is something I've been writing and researching on for 10 or 15 years, mainly in an academic setting, but also, you know, writing articles. But those articles would typically coincide with some outbreaks. So there'd be a flurry of interest when there was a swine flu pandemic right back in 2009, or the bird flu outbreaks of the noughties, or then Ebola in 2014. But, you know, as soon as those epidemic alarms were over, drops right down the news agenda, people lose interest and they cease to pay attention. And actually, I think that's part of a much wider pattern within public health and science in general, which maybe we can get to. But yeah, it's both sad to see one's worst fears confirmed, but it also does provide a wonderful opportunity, not only to sort of test sort of theories or themes that one sees in the past and the present, but also reflect back on what COVID-19 is. So there are all sorts of things that have happened during COVID-19 that have caused me to reflect on my interpretation of earlier historical pandemics. You know, so there are also all sorts of new insights that are being thrown up all the time, I think. And I find that fascinating.
I'm just sort of curious, like how can you just talk a little bit about what drew you into focusing so much on epidemics, outbreaks, pandemics? I mean, you put so much research and you know, you've written so much about them. Was there a single event that kind of sent you down this path, or did you just sort of get gradually absorbed into it?
So that is a good question. So I have an unusual journey into this. So for most of the first half of my life, I was a journalist working on The Guardian, The Observer, also doing investigations for TV. And then at a certain point, I became interested in writing books. And one of my first books was A Global History of Malaria, and the story about the first specific drug against malaria, which was quinine. So that made me interested in medical history, but I wasn't really interested in epidemics and pandemics until the early noughties, when we started to have these bird flu outbreaks. And really, actually, my interest in this field started with a magazine commission. You know, so I think it was around 2005. It could have been 6. There were outbreaks happening in Thailand, across Southeast Asia. And there was a big outbreak in Vietnam, and the editor of the Observer magazine came to me and said, listen, would you like to go and cover this story? There's a big conference going on in Ho Chi Minh City. And also at the time, there were some patients being held on isolation wards, including a brother and sister. And it's very interesting talking about that now, because long story short, I traveled to Vietnam and managed to negotiate my way via the authorities onto this ward at the French hospital, the old Tropical Diseases Hospital in Hanoi. And I had to put on a full biohazard suit in order to go onto this ward, where this brother and sister were on ventilators fighting for their life, because they had ARDS, you know, acute respiratory distress syndrome. So not unlike the distressing breathing difficulties that people with severe COVID have. And that was really my introduction. And, you know, it made me realize that, you know, first of all, these things aren't the stuff of science fiction. They can actually happen. And what we saw with the bird flu is we kind of dodged a bullet, you know. So there were some human infections, but luckily the virus wasn't widely communicable. And we didn't have these asymptomatic infections that we seem to have with COVID. So that really got me started, I suppose.
And then, I mean, you've combined the sort of in-person reporting with then a lot of historical work, because there are these interesting and often
Parallels.
forgotten outbreaks going way back that you've looked at. I'm curious how do you delve back into things where they have such a deep history?
Yeah, well, I mean, another good question. So, I mean, basically, after after writing a few articles on the bird flu outbreaks, and I decided that I became very interested in the Spanish influenza pandemic, and basically I began a PhD at the Wellcome Centre for the History of Medicine at University College London. So I was doing that in like around 2007. Before I'd even finished the PhD, the swine flu outbreak happened. And I vividly recall the exact moment that happened, because I was actually in Cleveland at a meeting of the American Association for the History of Medicine, about to present a paper on a completely forgotten pandemic called the Russian influenza pandemic of the 1890s. And on the Thursday before I was due to give that, turned on CBS News. They already had a reporter in Mexico City, another one on the border with California, and then someone at the White House. And I thought, uh-oh, it's not just a split screen, it's a quadruple screen. This is serious. Yeah, I mean, so basically I became more and more interested in this subject and saw it being played out in real time. But in order to retrieve the histories of these lesser known epidemics and pandemics, I had to travel to archives, principally in the United States, actually. So the Legionnaire's disease outbreak, which involved the CDC, many members of the CDC over many months, they deposited all their papers at the Smithsonian. So I was able to go there and look at it. Fascinating, they even had the sort of gifts that were handed out to the Legionnaires when they arrived for the conference, including, I was shocked to see a packet of Merit cigarettes. Because, right, it's a good idea. You give an elderly Legionnaire some cigarettes so he can enjoy himself during the conference.
Very 70s.
Very 70s. Parrot fever was harder because, there were quite a few.
You should explain what parrot fever was.
Oh yeah, sorry. So yeah, so parrot fever again is. Yeah, so parrot fever is possibly one of the most forgotten outbreaks of all. So parrot fever is a disease transmitted by parrots and parakeets. It's a bacteria, technical name Chlamydia psittaci. Basically, it's an intercellular parasite that is expelled in the bird's droppings. And typically what would happen would be in the 1930s, people used to, itinerant peddlers used to travel door to door, selling lovebirds, as they were known. So typically you would buy a lovebird as a gift for your wife or your girlfriend. They were particularly popular gifts around Thanksgiving and in the run up to Christmas. One reason they were popular is because in an era before FM radio or the internet or TV, these birds did tricks, they could be taught phrases, so they kept people company during the day. They were a way of like being less isolated, I suppose. But what people didn't realize is when the psittacosis bacteria was expelled in the droppings and then they became dried and desiccated, all it took was the bird to flap its wings and it would be aerosolized as fine dust particles, which would contaminate the whole room. So some of the first tragic cases were elderly women who had gathered for coffee clatches, and they were all, I envisaged them all seated around a coffee table with a parakeet above them, and they were inhaling these particles, and they cause very, very severe atypical pneumonias. Mortality rate was quite high. I believe as high as 10–20%. And it was a very serious outbreak for a short period of time. And technically it was a pandemic because it simultaneously occurred in, I think, 12 countries worldwide, although very few people were killed and perhaps not many infected. It kind of raises questions about what a pandemic is, I suppose, which is a term that's changed its meaning over time and depending on political circumstances.
Yeah, that is true. That is true. So, I mean, it's interesting, considering your book, which you wrote before COVID, obviously. And it makes, now that we're dealing with this pandemic, I'm kind of wondering what it was like for you, having researched all these pandemics and epidemics and outbreaks, having seen the patterns. In January, when I think about it in January, I think I can remember sort of a vague sense of unease. Honestly, like, I was not familiar with these Chinese cities.
No.
And then we're
Who
starting.
had heard of Wuhan? I'm ashamed to say I hadn't.
Yeah, I'm completely provincial. I totally accept that. Yes, and then then when I learned that Wuhan was bigger than New York and that they had shut the whole city down, I thought, this pneumonia seems like this is not good. But I'm curious. But I'd really be curious to hear what your experience was. I mean, did you just sort of say like, this is it? This is what I have been waiting for, or not waiting for, but expecting?
No, I didn't think that immediately in January. Of course, I was extremely interested in it, and in the first, I mean, if we think back to the start of last year, 2019, let's not forget it began with these horrendous wildfires all across Australia. So that was a dominant story in the beginning. So I don't think I clocked right away that, ProMed had picked up some chatter. But as soon as we saw that, there were reports of Chinese people clamoring to go to hospitals, then I thought, wow, this is starting to look serious, right? But if you remember those first weeks, I mean, I was very cautious. After all, we've had lots of scares like this, particularly around bird flu and swine flu. So I wasn't sure what to make of it, but there were already things happening that started to send off little alarm bells in my mind. So yes, I mean, definitely when by the 23rd of January, they announced they were quarantining Wuhan, and then very shortly after they put something like 35 million people in neighborhoods also under quarantine. I think that was a huge wake-up call. But the data was very confusing initially. But I think the thing that really made me start to say, could this be the long predicted big one, right? The pandemic modeled, or for which 1918 was the kind of the template of all our imagined pandemic disasters. What really made me start to think that way was when we saw overnight them building extra capacity, like larger hospitals with these massive waiting rooms. But one of those photographs which showed this then empty waiting room in Wuhan with all the cots laid out in rows, ready to receive this deluge of patients, immediately made me think of this iconic picture from the 1918-1919 Spanish influenza pandemic. So if you look at any book on that, such as John Barry's The Great Influenza, this picture shows an emergency influenza ward at a US Army camp in Kansas, Camp Funston, Fort Riley Camp Funston. And it shows basically all these men recovering soldiers laid out in cots in this big auditorium that's been hastily converted. And it seems to be a picture that was taken at the end of an epidemic that struck that camp in the spring of 1918. And there's long been a controversy about exactly what that picture depicts. So we know from reports at the time that all the soldiers were struck by a flu-like illness. And many epidemiologists and some virologists have interpreted it as one of the herald waves of what would become the Spanish influenza, if not the first spring wave of that disease. But what it shows you is that one of the first signatures of an epidemic or pandemic, when it actually starts to sicken a significant number of people, is you suddenly get lots of people who need treatment, right? And they quickly overwhelm your medical capacities. So that's when I started thinking, wow, this is starting to look a little bit like 1918. But I think I was very cautious because the last thing you want to be accused of as an author is fomenting panic or hysteria, especially when one of the messages of my book is the way that we have a responsibility not to do that. And part of what I was trying to do is to show how science and uncertainty about different risks creates a fertile ground for panic and hysteria when perhaps it's not always called for. And that's the point we do. I'm always very wary of being accused of crying wolf, right? Which is what the World Health Organization, the trap they fell into, I think, with swine flu in 2009.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned panic. I mean, that is an interesting aspect of your book. Is like you note a number of cases where panic set off by an outbreak itself is quite destructive. I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit about that kind of lesson from these past outbreaks.
Yeah. Well, in a way, it's kind of it's almost easier to do that in relation to COVID-19. So shortly after, when we started to realize it was spreading, we had this extraordinary panic buying of toilet paper and other household stuff, and that was quite, I think, baffling to me and many people. I guess this is like kind of learned behavior from watching too many disaster films about what you need to stock up on. There wasn't, as far as I can tell, I mean, so in 1918, there were sort of similar panics around, people would clamored for certain drugs. There were long queues outside chemists and druggists. Interestingly, people lined up to get quinine. So although quinines are specific for malaria, many people thought that because malaria is you have chills and fevers, and the cycle of chills and fevers does resemble the symptoms you get with flu, that maybe it would have some effect. And there was nothing else in 1918. So you saw that sort of panic going on. But I think most of all, I'm kind of reminded of so in 1916, the story I start my book with, when polio first became a big community disease problem, when there was a big outbreak in New York in 1916. So we know that polio had been in the United States at least from, I think, the 1890s. But it wasn't. Most people were asymptomatic, so that there hadn't really been a trace signal until there was this big outbreak in New York, and that caused a huge panic with people trying to flee the city. The health of, the outbreak was centered on an area of Brooklyn close to the riverfront called Pigtown, which was home to lots of Italian immigrants from Naples. So at the time, Brooklyn was nothing like it is today. You didn't have fancy residences. You basically had lots of tenement buildings with large areas with just like piles of rubbish where people let pigs graze freely on the refuse. And it was thought that, the dirt and the unsanitary conditions were what was spreading polio, that it was, people thought it was a kind of a respiratory illness or could be spread by flies breeding on garbage. Rather, they didn't realize it was spread by the oral fecal route. But anyway, there was a big panic, and the authorities quarantined people. They went door to door, seized people who thought were sick, forced them into isolation. And wealthy New Yorkers were able to sort of escape from the Upper East Side to their homes in Long Island, or even head to the New Jersey shore. But soon, Pennsylvania and other states put up patrols at those state lines to stop people crossing the border. So that was a real example of a panic, which I don't think many people remember now.
No. I mean, in doing research for reporting on COVID vaccines, I've found myself going back and reading about polio a lot, because of course the polio vaccine story is such a classic story of vaccine discovery. And it really struck me just how just brutal it must have been to have that anxiety. Maybe because I'm a parent, and that was a disease that really struck children. And as you say, like, I mean, was it 1916? Seems
Yeah.
like when it's, Salk doesn't do his vaccine until the 50s, and so you've got decades where parents in cities like New York are just so anxious that their kids might become paralyzed or die. And I just, it just, having grown up in the same area, like, I just can't, I can't put myself in that mindset. It's too much, and in a way, like, maybe COVID, part of the challenge with COVID for countries like the United States or maybe England is that we just have sort of, had the good fortune to not have to deal with these things recently. I mean,
Yeah,
maybe,
exactly.
I don't know if you feel like, I mean, I've been struck by like how in Africa, they haven't in much, it seems like, to some extent it's under much better control in places like Africa, maybe because, like, oh yeah, we just finished dealing with Ebola. Like, we deal with this all the time, and we take it seriously, and we know the devastation it can cause.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, of course, Africa has a much younger population generally.
That's true. That is true. That is a big factor.
But I do think you make a good point, because so yes, there's Ebola, but there are lots of other infectious diseases such as malaria or diarrheal diseases that are, a sort of constant feature of living in those endemic areas of Africa. But during Ebola, during the outbreak in 2014, of course, we had a massive effort to control Ebola through contact tracing, through essentially, test and trace and isolate. And we mobilized a massive military and humanitarian response, right? 3 nations, France, Britain, but with the leadership from the United States, with Obama, convening, a sort of Ebola war room regularly, with Anthony Fauci at his side, all stuff that hasn't happened during this epidemic.
No.
But the point is that, the way they got Ebola under control, and I remember it vividly, I wrote a paper on this, was that, the slogan was getting to zero. The idea was that if you could track down every last patient and then their contacts and the contacts of the contacts, you would finally get to a point where there was no longer community transmission. And they succeeded in doing that. But it took massive resources, it took military involvement. But I do think that's true. I do think your point you make is right, that, Africa has benefited from that, and they've also benefited from the legacy of these HIV programs. So when Ebola arrived when it was introduced by a Liberian businessman to Lagos, right, one of the biggest cities in Africa, the fact they already had well-resourced HIV and polio programs meant they had ready-made teams of public health contact tracers they could deploy. And that's what stopped it actually spreading. That would have been a real disaster. So I do think that we have kind of forgotten. I think partly it goes to this idea of hubris. So my book, subtitle Panic, Hysteria, and Hubris. When I was writing this book, I was mainly thinking about how scientists themselves can be guilty of complacency. So the idea that, in the 1970s, many medical researchers thought that infectious disease was no longer going to be an interesting problem for research because we basically succeeded in the conquest of infectious disease. It was no longer going to be a pressing societal problem. It was going to be chronic diseases. But I think that because of the success of polio and other vaccines, there are two generations at least now who have lived through this period where we've collectively, as a society, grown complacent. So there's a kind of societal hubris that we don't have to worry about these disease risks because, we haven't experienced measles as children. We can't then see the point, or some people can't see the point in vaccination because they think it's kind of all a trick by the pharma industry. And if you go on to some of these anti-vax sites, you'll see people actually advocating natural immunization, right? Yeah. Which is kind of the default position people had to put up with in the early years of polio before we got a vaccine. You had no choice but to either take your risks. It was better actually to get polio young than wait like Franklin Delano Roosevelt did to his 30s when you could end up with a much more severe reaction. So yeah, I do think that explains a lot of what's been going on and the difficulties of managing societal responses in Western democracies.
So after, 9 months or so, I mean, does the pandemic we're in, does it remind you in any particular way of any particular pandemics? Do you feel like there's a particular one that has a lot of lessons for us, or does it feel like it's different?
Well, I do think that still the closest analogy is with influenza. It's not as bad clearly as the Spanish influenza, although it's quite hard to say precisely why that is, because of course in 1918 there was no real social distancing.
And no antibiotics either.
No antibiotics, no vaccine. And we know the case fatality rate without all those things was around 2.5%. Certainly, in modern industrialized countries. Of course, in India it was much higher. It was more like 6% and over. So it was really like a plague there. But that was without social distancing. So it could be, the case fatality rate for COVID, changes with the data almost daily, doesn't it? But it's somewhere between 0.7% and maybe as high as 2 or even 2.5. So I do think it's quite similar to Spanish flu in that respect, the number of people who might actually end up dying because of this. But I think the major difference, and what I come back to continually, and why I get very frustrated with some scientists who are kind of promoting, what I say is bogus herd immunity strategies, is that whenever an influenza pandemic comes along, and this includes 1918, there's always some crossover immunity. So even though it's a new pandemic strain, we know that each pandemic influenza virus shares many proteins in common with previous ones, and therefore there's always some partial immunity in the population that we can count on to, reduce the sort of spread of the disease. And that's why typically when people model pandemics, influenza pandemics, the assumption is that up to a third of the population will be infected, get to the disease, and then recover and have some immunity. But neither of those assumptions applies, or we don't know that they apply, right? Because first of all, it's a completely new virus, right? So as far as we can tell, there is absolutely no immunity to it. Of course, there may be, as you know, I mean, you're probably more expert than I on this, but there may be something we're not seeing or quite understanding about, more innate immune responses, T cell responses or memory cell responses because of exposure to other coronaviruses that might share something in common.
I don't think there's any solid evidence of that.
No, exactly.
We should not be relying on that, as you say.
Yeah.
Like it's a false complacency.
Exactly. So what I keep coming back to when people say this is, what is different is it's about immunology. It's about immunology, right? It really is, because the assumption by the modelers is that we need to get to 60 or 80% of people being immunized naturally if that's the only option, and then they recover. And the assumption is they will then have immunity, but we now know from later studies that immunity seems to wane after several months. So we can't even count on that. So that is why I think the end game, people are constantly asking, how does this epidemic end? In the case of influenza epidemics, it's simply past ones. We didn't have vaccines, or we couldn't mobilize them. In 57 and 68, we really weren't able to mobilize them quickly enough to actually affect the course of the epidemic. They essentially ended because a third of the population got the disease, recovered, and then had enough immunity so that the R dropped. I don't think we can count on that with COVID. And I think there's been a lot of wishful thinking that, it's going to go away like a miracle. It's just sort of this sort of constant magical thinking in the face of scientific facts.
Yeah, it is frustrating, and especially now when we're talking, at the end of October, and certainly for residents of the northern hemisphere, where winter is going to be getting rather cold, and we're going to want to stay inside and have lots of be breathing in lots of dry air with lots of droplets in it. I mean, it doesn't bode well, I don't think. I mean, what happened in 1918 when the fall came?
Well, I mean, gosh, it doesn't really bear thinking about, because of course the second wave, which coincided with, as you say, the fall and winter of 1918 to 1919, was the most deadly season of all. Something like 60% of the deaths across the three waves of the pandemic occurred in those really 6-week period from the end of October through to January. And yeah, it was particularly bad for people in the middle age ranges, young adults aged 20 to 40. I think we know enough about COVID to know that, generally people in those age ranges aren't as at significant risk, and that it's really the elderly age groups. But we could see that change. We could see the virus adapting, or depending on who's sheltering and who's getting more exposure, we could see changes in the type of patients that present. So
yeah, I remember just recently some people, there was a discussion I was following where they were talking about the 1918 flu and the waves of it, and I guess is there like a debate about whether the virus itself became more virulent as over the course? I mean, could that be part of the reason why it got so bad, or is it, what do you think, it was just everyone sort of crowding inside once it gets cold?
Yeah, it's difficult to say. I mean, it certainly seems that when it initially emerged in the spring, it was a milder illness. So there are different theories about this, and part of the problem is that we have very little physical evidence of virus from 1918. So I think we only have 6 samples that were retrieved from viral archaeological remains, and the earliest is from May 1918. So really what we'd want is like earlier isolates from before May. and also in the later period into 1919 to see if there had been changes. But it does seem that it did adapt, it very rapidly adapted to people. So the thing is, it emerged from some avian reservoir, possibly direct to humans, maybe at passage through another mammal. But in a that happened very shortly before it became a human adapted virus. But when it first emerged in March and April of 1918, and that's the photograph that we have from Camp Funston, it typically caused a 3-day illness. There were some deaths, but a very, very, very small proportion. So something did happen. It did seem to adapt and become more virulent in young adults. So that is worrying. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's so striking how you know, all you can do when you're doing your work as a historian is to go back and look at these like bits and pieces and try to figure out what might have happened. And now, I mean, you know, like there are like hundreds of thousands, literally, of virus genomes that are like, you know, archived in databases. I mean, so we're sort of just, the history is being recorded in like molecular detail as we go forward. It's I guess for me, that's a big contrast.
Yeah. Well, for me, that's why I find medical history. I mean, to answer your earlier question, why did I get into this field? So I kind of entered it, I suppose, partly because as a journalist, epidemics aren't just sort of medical crises, right, or a particular crisis for the individual affected. When an epidemic or pandemic is serious enough, you see that it exposes all the fractures and weaknesses in societies, and it lays bare dysfunction with institutions, but also dysfunctional health and political systems. But it also shines a light on, you know, social behavior. You see all sorts of psychological and emotional responses writ large. So there's really no aspect of social, cultural, political life that's unaffected. What I do think, though, is not completely unprecedented, but certainly unprecedented in the modern era. So I just want to mention, so I called my book The Pandemic Century. And I suppose partly that was simply a way of ordering the series of pandemics beginning in 1918. But I do think there is something that makes the last 100 years different from the previous centuries in which, so if we go back to the Middle Ages, of course, we had the Black Death, that was a pandemic. And in the early 19th century, we had cholera epidemics that were spread worldwide. But we didn't actually talk about pandemics. Pandemics doesn't really enter the medical or popular lexicon until the 1890s. It's actually really coincides with the Russian influenza pandemic, which is, so what was different about the modern period and why I think it makes sense to think of this last century or a bit as a pandemic century is its modern communications, its trade, faster, you know, more international trade, more interconnectivity, but also faster international communications. And not just physical communications that allow pathogens to be transferred by train or rail or ships from one country to another, but the information, the mediatization, the news about that also spreads instantly, faster than the virus itself. And that is something you can date absolutely from the 1890s with the advent of the worldwide telegraph. And what you see, interestingly, if you go back to the 1890s, is that it's as much a media panic or pandemic as it is, you know, a medical viral pandemic. And I think that has been a big part of the story of these epidemics and pandemics in the 20th century. You see that very clearly with SARS in 2003, which, the panic about SARS was worse than the epidemic itself. It shut down international aviation, wiped 50 billion off the Southeast Asian hotel and tourism industries, caused very serious recession in Toronto where there was a big outbreak. And what is different, what is, I suppose, unique about COVID-19 is we are social distancing on a scale that's never been attempted before in the whole history of medicine. It's certainly not something I ever imagined was possible. One could certainly have anticipated that authoritarian regimes like China could compel their citizens to do this. But the idea that, develop advanced Western democracies where people value their liberty and freedom would be able to do that, would be able to persuade their citizens on the whole to, regulate their behavior for the common good. I don't think I imagined that was possible. We're now seeing, of course, how it's coming under extreme strain and people are refusing to go along with it. So,
yeah. I mean, I was sort of reminded you're talking about the telegraph and such, and information, and we're sort of at the point now where we understand these things that cause these pandemics so well that ultimately we can reduce them to information just in terms of the genome of these things. And I was kind of amazed to talk with vaccine developers. I'd say, like, so when did you start making the vaccine? And they you can ask them, and like they'll say, a lot of them will say January 10th. And then you say, well, why January 10th? And they're like, well, these Chinese researchers had sequenced the genome of the virus and they put it online, and we got it that night and we started work that night. And it's like, I've heard that from so many vaccine makers. It was like, well, we got the genome, we can get to work. And this was like way before anybody realized how bad it was going to be. But so that's
well, I think it's good that you pointed that out, because there has been a lot of criticism of China's response, especially in the first weeks, where perhaps they missed an opportunity to prevent the virus spreading more widely. But the good thing they did, which was different from SARS-1 in 2003, was they very quickly sequenced the genome and shared that data worldwide. I think that's a real advance.
Yeah. So, I mean, I mean, has there ever been a pandemic where, I guess it's hard to think of a pandemic where like the development of a vaccine was sort of part of the story. I mean, is there anything like this that?
Well, I mean, I suppose the closest parallel is HIV, where there was a huge effort to develop a vaccine. NIH poured huge resources into it. Anthony Fauci surely remembers that very well. And there were high hopes at the beginning, but we still don't have a vaccine for HIV.
So it's been what, like almost 40 years, I guess, since they started, maybe 35 years since they started trying to make a vaccine. And
I mean, there's been a similar, the other, I mean, it wasn't a pandemic, but, malaria has been a target for vaccine manufacturers for decades now. And we have made progress, but still we're a long way off to having a reliable prophylactic vaccine for that. I mean, no, most epidemic, I mean, most of the pandemics that, we were fearing, such as bird flu and swine flu, there was certainly prototype, platforms for those vaccines ready. But the story of all those epidemics is that, it takes 6 months at minimum to actually, be able to deploy a vaccine. And I think in swine flu, we did succeed in doing that. We did deploy an emergency vaccine.
In
the 2009 swine flu pandemic, that was a pandemic. We deployed a vaccine.
But it was, I think it took about, I'm trying to remember, I was just writing about this. I think it took about 6 or 7 months. I mean, it started, it was emerging in the spring, and they, I mean, at least in the United States, they didn't start giving it out till October.
I mean, of course, I mean, and you've just reminded me of so when I was writing the chapter on Legionnaire's disease in 1976, and this goes right to the theme of the book, of course, the epidemic or pandemic everyone was expecting was another influenza epidemic. And in February of 76, there was an outbreak of an atypical swine flu at Fort Dix, US Army base in New Jersey. A lot of American scientists thought, this is it. It was of H1, it was an H1N1 variant virus, very similar to the H1N1 Spanish flu. So there was a huge panic about that, and a vaccine was deployed, right? The whole American population was immunized. And then the epidemic never materialized. And in the meantime, there were all sorts of adverse reactions that people rightly or wrongly blamed on the vaccine. So yeah, it's a difficult thing. It's difficult getting the call right. And even when you do, will it be ready quickly enough to make a difference?
Yeah, yeah. So I imagine that you must get asked a lot by friends and family, like what to be the fortune teller, to say like, oh, what does our future look like?
Yeah. So
what do you think? What's 2021 going to be like, or 2022?
Well, my daughter asks me this constantly because she's in her 20s, and she feels like she's being robbed of some of the best months, at least, of her life. And I think it's really difficult for young people. It's difficult for everyone, but particularly for younger generation, for whom this is usually one of the best times of your life, when you're in your 20s and you can go traveling and freedom. I mean, I will say what I told her once I realized. I mean, so for me, just to answer your earlier question, when the penny actually dropped that this was a really serious pandemic and we need to wake up, was in February this year, when we got the first reports in Europe of this massive outbreak in Lombardy. That was the third week in February. And that's the point where, when I was interviewed on radio, I said, no, we need to take this seriously. I was no longer fearful of crying wolf. I thought, I'd much rather go down as someone who warned people rightly, if when maybe it wasn't called for. But right back then I said, look, there's no immunity to this, so don't expect it to be over quickly, And I almost got quite Darwinian about it. I said, the people who are going to survive this are people who adjust their mindset and adapt to the fact that this isn't going away soon, and we're going to have to change the way we interact. I think that is clearly going to be the case now, at least until the end of the winter, February or March. There will be a respite in spring and summer for the same reasons that you mentioned earlier, because people won't spend as much time indoors and there won't be as much mixing. But I think the only thing that's going to make a difference and end this is a vaccine. And I think there's a good chance we'll have one by the summer of 2021, if not earlier. Is that your reading?
Yeah, I think so. But we are going to be dealing with a kind of a paradoxical situation, potentially, of a vaccine that is kind of like a flu vaccine, and then maybe it's 50% effective, maybe 40, maybe 60. So what do you do then? When you've gotten the vaccine and you're not totally invincible, you could still get sick. So how do how do we adjust our behavior then? Like right now, certainly there are lots of people who have got total pandemic fatigue and they want to just pretend like it's not a problem when we don't even have a vaccine. So then if you sort of add in like, okay, now you're vaccinated, but you've got 50% immunity, and or like you might, maybe like you'll only get a mild disease, but you might pass it on to an older person and kill them. I think I don't know if we know how to sort of manage that public health situation. I don't know if there's any precedent for that in the past.
Yeah, I don't think there are, because most well, not most, but you know, the most successful vaccines are one dose, or you have them when you're a child. So you'll have one dose, then a booster, and that's it. You're set for life. I think there are multiple challenges. The reasons you point out, you know, we may not get perfect immunity. You may need booster shots regularly. And that's what I see the real problem. I think the real problem is persuading enough of the population to even take a vaccine in the first place. So, I mean, after all, we have a sizable minority now who don't even think the coronavirus SARS-CoV-2 is real. They think it's a hoax. They think it's all a put-up job by scientists and, you know, elites to sort of rob them of their freedoms. So I think it's a very difficult public health situation to manage when you have such wide distrust and skepticism. I read a poll somewhere that 30% of Americans would not accept a vaccine if they were offered one. The polling, I think, in Europe is low. I think it's right around 8% of the population. But you know, these are still sizable pockets of what they call vaccine hesitancy. And you know, we could find that. I mean, for me, it's all really about protecting the most vulnerable population. So, you know, it'd be great if we had a vaccine that offers some protection to the most elderly, you know, people 60 and over, right? It'd be good if we also had vaccine, but I believe you wrote an article saying nobody's actually developing a vaccine for children. That's not even on the agenda.
That actually, I will.
No,
I will qualify that. Yes, I wrote that 2 or 3 weeks ago for the New York Times. That
yeah.
There were pediatricians who were saying like, "Hey, we need to start testing for kids," and I think everyone just assumes that it's just that it's part of the package, but you do have to do a total separate thing. Pfizer has started, and the others are going to start soon. So yeah, so we should, you know, I mean, we could, we could talk for another hour about this. There's so much.
But I think this vaccine is an interesting question because my book actually came out in 2019. If you recall, the big story then were these measles outbreaks that were taking place all over the world, actually, but particularly in Brooklyn and in Oregon and Washington. That was all caused by communities who just, you know, had got out of the habit of vaccinating their children or actively didn't believe that, you know, this was a legitimate, helpful thing to do. So that was the then pandemic. We had a pandemic of, you know, measles returning because of a lack of people using a well-tried vaccine that stopped it. So, yeah.
Well, I think we need to wrap it up. Like I said, we could keep talking for hours more. I mean, it's fascinating and sobering. But anyway, I'd just like to thank the Charleston Literary Festival for allowing Mark and I to have this conversation. And and I hope it stimulates some questions for people who are listening into us. So thanks very much.
Yes, thank you very much. Great to talk to you, Carl. And
you too.
To attend the Charleston Festival virtually, if not in person. That's the problem with pandemics. It limits our ability to move and meet. All right.
Next time in Charleston. See ya.
Next time.